Hello everyone. In this episode we turn our attention to human capital inequality and deprivation, focusing on education inequality and health inequality and deprivation. And in the next episode we'll turn our attention to gender inequality. First, by way of a brief review of what we covered in our first episode on human capital, chapter 8, we have the relationship between earnings on the one hand and the life cycle of people depending upon their education. So we have age on the x-axis and we have annual income over here on the y-axis for people based on household data. In that first episode we looked at two cases, Venezuela and Mexico. This is the case for Venezuela. And for example, we see that for university graduates, they don't have the earnings in the earlier years when they are in school as the others do. However, they start off at a higher level of income immediately upon graduating, and then before long have cumulative lifetime earnings also that exceed those who left school earlier. The most extreme example on the other side with those with no education, some began work as young as 10, and this is their much lower lifetime cycle of earnings. So this looks at the distribution over time for different individuals in their averages based upon education. The model we looked at was really a stylized representation of those kinds of patterns. We have age on the x-axis and we have the amount of earnings on the y-axis. This is the profile of earnings over time for the primary graduates, similar to what we saw before, from here about age 13 to age 66, drawn arbitrarily. And so that the earnings for those who graduate from high school are higher. They begin higher and the gap widens over time. So that the returns to education are the cumulative differences between what you earn having only finished primary school and what you earn having gone and finished high school. And so this is the income, monetary benefits from doing so. In contrast, for the family to decide whether this is a good investment or not, they compare that with the costs. Those include direct costs. Direct costs include tuition. They also include, for many children, room and board costs. For example, there may not be a high school close enough to your village, and so you stay in a dormitory. For just as an example, perhaps there's costs of paper and pens and workbooks and so on. Very importantly, there's also indirect costs. And these are the cumulative earnings foregone that you would have gained if instead of going to high school, you had gone out to work at that point. So these are the indirect or additional opportunity costs of schooling that have to be taken into account. Of course, future income has to be discounted because of the fact that, as usual, a dollar today is worth more to you than a dollar in the future. And so one compares the discounted benefits, extra income, with the current and discounted indirect costs when you make the decision, and direct costs to decide, is this a good investment or not? Another important point on this, all of this concerns the choice on the part of an individual or individual family, parents say. From the social point of view, we need to make a couple of adjustments to find out the rate of return from society-wide. In particular, education is usually subsidized. That's part of direct costs. Government subsidizes education. And so that in looking at a social analysis, you would add back in those subsidies among the direct costs. On the other hand, there may be social benefits to students ending up with higher amounts of education. Maybe the fact that they're literate can benefit others. Maybe the fact that they're educated citizens can be beneficial to the country. So if there's positive externalities of this kind, then one has to include that as a benefit from the social point of view. But otherwise, we're looking at, once again, the discounted social benefits of additional education against the current and discounted, over a period of a few years, say, amounts of costs for sending a child for additional education. Then it's important to note that the number of years of schooling is not the sole factor, of course, in determining earnings. So here's data from the study. This is years of completed education, and this is income on the left axis. On the y-axis, it's the log of a weekly earnings. And so that we see there's a strong positive relationship. This is not over the life cycle. This is just looking at one year, or 1 week actually, as the data go. It shows there's a positive relationship between the years of completed education and earnings, however, with much variability. So for the cases of those with completing 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, and 16 years, distributions of earnings are shown. They actually come out this way, but they're flattened so that you can see them here. And you see that although we find our average here, there's a great deal of variation in each of these cases. And so that variation comes from various sources. Of course, what you studied in school matters. Of course, the quality of education you received matters also. And also discrimination matters, whether gender, race, caste, and so on. Turning then to the framework that we started also chapter 5 with, think about social welfare. It's a broad function. It depends upon the average income in the society, the amount of education and the amount of health in society, and other factors. Empowerment was an example. But in addition to averages, now we're turning to consider some inequality as well as special deprivations in these indicators. And in this regard, just as it is true for a society, thinking about total national income will increase with income, with more education, and with more health, the data say, but also education and health go to increase productivity and raise income. Same is true for an individual. Individuals have reason to value income, education, and health separately, but in addition, having higher education and health leads to higher productivity and hence higher incomes. So that makes it a special thing to consider, this human capital factor. So that when we often look at education and health, we have statistics like life expectancy, but by definition, that's an average. And so we want to move beyond these averages and now think about inequality in education and in health, and to some extent, an equivalent to thinking about poverty, which is severe deprivation in one of these human capital dimensions. Deprivation in education might be illiteracy. Deprivation in health might be having a life expectancy at birth below some threshold, such as a life expectancy of 40 at the time that you're born. Turning then to inequality in education, just as we use Lorenz curves and the resulting Gini coefficients in our study of income inequality, we do the same for the study of educational inequality. Here, instead of looking at education, instead of looking at income, we're looking at years of education. Very difficult to measure quality. So for the case over here of India, this goes back to the 1990s, but I think that the data make a very nice, clear comparison. For the case of India, like we always would in this case, we have the cumulative portion of the population. It started at age 15 and over. Of course, those who are 2 or 3 years old are not going to have any schooling. So it starts at 15 years and older, a standard UNESCO way to do this. And on the y-axis, we have the cumulative portion of schooling. So we think about a total number of years of school that's been completed in the country of India as a whole. And then the question is, what fraction of these are accounted for by the successively higher education achievers? So that here we have those with no schooling. This is what gives us a very high amount of inequality in this picture. At this point, over 50% of the people still had no recorded schooling. Then we look at primary, middle school, secondary, university, and postgraduate education, and we get a resulting Lorenz curve from which we can find a Gini coefficient. We start with a 45-degree line of perfect educational equality, as if everyone, for example, had 12 years of school and stopped. And how far bowed out is the actual Lorenz curve from that? We find in area A, in relation to the whole triangle, A plus is area B, and it looks like about 2/3. It looks well bowed out to the point where it's 2/3 of the way, and in fact we find a Gini of 0.69 for this case. Here is a different country, South Korea, from the 1990s, and you see that their Lorenz curve for education is much closer to the line of perfect equality. They had a different strategy. Their strategy was first to see how many they could possibly get through, in some sense, 8th grade, and then subsequently to see how many they could get through secondary school, with much less emphasis on getting people into university training, which is what India and many other developing countries gave a disproportionate focus to. Here we have, naturally, a much lower educational Gini coefficient calculated of 0.22. Here we have the relationship between the average years of education and the educational Gini coefficient, calculated for India and calculated for South Korea, as we saw before, but also a large number of other countries. There's a couple of reasons for this strong relationship. One is that countries that have high average years of education, like the United States and South Korea, are those with high levels of average income. They can afford more people to have more years of education. Another is simply the way that education is defined in this way. Years of schooling, very few people get a second PhD, very few. And so that we can think about almost an upper bound of around 21 years of schooling for people. And what this means is that as we pull away from the case, such as we had in India, of many people not going to school at all, and we have increases as people finish primary and then get up and finish more and more, at least, of secondary education, everyone is moving toward this sort of upper bound of 21 years. And so just that fact alone is going to make this negative relationship between years of education on average in a country and the overall country's educational Gini coefficient. Turning now to health, I'll look at this in a slightly different way. We're going to think about wealth here. Now, this is the children's likelihood to die in some selected countries. This is from the early 2000s. Here we have 8 representative countries, or is it 7? It's 8 countries, and we have Peru, which has about 40% of all deaths of children under 5 accounted for by the bottom 20% in the wealth distribution. So double the proportion. In contrast, there is only a small fraction of under 5 deaths accounted for by the richest 20% in the case of Peru, and the case of Nicaragua is relatively similar. There's always such a pattern. Here we have the case for Benin and Malawi in Africa. The under 5 deaths are more than proportionately found in the bottom quintile of the wealth distribution. However, there is still an imbalance, a very clear imbalance between the more wealthy and the less wealthy quintiles. The closer relationships here have something to do also with the fact that we are seeing lower average income and average wealth in these countries. Here's some additional information. It's in a figure in the textbook, and so that you can compare these relationships for additional countries. Now turning to proportion of children under 5 who are underweight, an important indicator of health, by household wealth, data from around 2008. And so this is broken down for different regions. For example, this is the relationship for the region of Southern Asia. And we find here that among the poorest 20% measured by wealth, determined from household surveys, we find that over 60% of the children were underweight, which is a z-score below a certain point of average. And so that while more than 60% were underweight for the poorest 20%, this figure was much lower, closer to 30%, say, for those in the richest 20%. So this is the distribution across South Asia. We also have developing regions as a whole, and we have sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Northern Asia and the former Soviet areas. And so we can see that there's a strong relationship here between wealth and the outcomes for children's well-being. Being underweight is an indicator of poor nutrition, and so that poor nutrition, we know, affects the child's health right away at the age they are, but this also influences their well-being throughout their life. Here we have the proportion of children under 5 who are underweight, and I want to end this, though, with some positive reminder of how much progress has been made. And so this compares the years 1990 with the year 2018. And here we have different regions in the developing world. And so we see, for example, in Southern Asia, that we had just looked at as our first example a moment ago, if you go back to 1990, the fraction of children under 5 who were underweight was just about 50%. Whereas in 2018, 28 years later, this fraction had fallen to 27%. Not quite falling in half, but getting to having fallen in half. So on this note, and seeing that a similar pattern of improvement occur and have been seen throughout the developing world, I'm going to end this episode, and we will follow it up looking at gender and inequality in developing countries.